Rain pattered against the roof of my car as I rolled down the dark wooded back road in the dead of night. My car ornaments, a pair of blue dice and the club symbol, jostled around as I weathered each bump in the road. My eyes drifted from side to side lazily, carefully observing the darkened tree line to make sure no deer or possums were intent on flinging themselves in front of my car. I had just gotten off of a long, boring overtime shift at the Olympus Hydroelectric Dam in Buckley. I wasn't an engineer or anything actually helpful to the dam itself. I was one of their desk workers in charge of analyzing the finances and working out renewable energy quotas and other boring stuff like that. I didn't particularly enjoy the job, but it left Friday and my weekends free and paid a six-figure salary. It was about the best I was going to get at this point in my career, so I had just decided to deal with all the annoying little quirks of the job. We worked a lot of overtime in addition to our long shifts. It was pretty common to work 12 or 14 hours a day, 4 days in a row, and then crash the entire weekend. That was just part of the work culture. Honestly, though, it wasn't even the worst part. That, I had decided, was the commute. I didn't live in Buckley. It was a small half-backwater town in northern Nebraska, full of that disingenuous, friendly charm that made me sick to my stomach. The town itself was so bright and vibrant during the day that it made me jealous. How could all these people be so happy to go to school or their cushy small-town jobs while I had to commute to an office and do paperwork for the next 14 hours? As annoying as it was to drive through the town during the day, however, it was downright creepy to drive back through it at night. It was like a pleasant mask slipped off when the sun went down, and the town revealed what it truly was. A frigid, dispassionate, and unwelcoming place to outsiders like me. I felt like the very streets themselves no longer wanted me there after dark. It almost made the rough, twisted roads of the forest leading out of town preferable. Almost. The trees out here hung so low they threatened to scrape the paint off my freshly waxed car, and the rough road was an unpleasant ride that got unreasonably slippery in the winter. Part of me wanted to bite the bullet and just move into Buckley so I could avoid the commute. But God knows I'd go absolutely crazy living in such a dichotomous town. In Sudbury, nothing ever changed, we kept to ourselves, and that's how I liked it. As my mind wandered from topic to topic, I saw a left turn on the road up ahead. This particular sharp, steep turn always gave me a little bit of trouble, so I had to slow down and focus my thoughts on the task at hand. Right before I turned the wheel, however, my lights illuminated something past the bend, about 30 feet into the previously darkened tree line. I came to a stop. The object was some kind of wooden puppet, about 7 feet tall, leaning against a tree. Its articulated fingers were wrapped around a branch just above its head, which was staring at the road. It didn't have any eyes or other facial features, which led my mind to the brief, chilling possibility that it was meant to be looking at me. Atop the smooth, featureless head was a wide-brimmed felt cap, with an obnoxious red feather sticking out the side. The cap fluttered in the wind and rain, but remained affixed to the marionette's head. Clearly it had been glued or stitched on. At the marionette's waist was a black leather belt with a holstered cavalry sword. Across the marionette's chest was a bandolier of black powder charges and musket balls, and an ornate bayonet-affixed musket was strapped to its back. A wooden musketeer. The puppet had been painstakingly carved out of wood over what must have been hundreds of hours by a master craftsman. Something like this belonged in an art museum, not the middle of a forest between two small towns nobody cared about. It looked eerily out of place amidst the swaying trees. I quickly took out my iPhone 6, taking a few seconds to fiddle with the camera settings before I snapped a photo of the thing. It was almost midnight, so I didn't want to spend an abundance of time examining the thing to determine all of its intricacies. That could wait until the weekend. I turned the car left, my front wheel going off the road for a moment as I turned, which caused the interior of the car to rattle uncomfortably for a few seconds as I continued down the road. A few minutes later, I breached the tree line, finally rolling into the outskirts of Sudbury. Here, I found the cold and empty streets comforting. Though the atmosphere was roughly the same as Buckley, this place didn't try to hide the ugly parts during the day. It was more honest, I felt, and that made it more bearable. Less of a dichotomy. As I pulled down the central street of Sudbury, I could faintly make out the Trevitt Manor atop a small hill off in the distance. I had always wondered what was inside that strange, Baroque manor, dimly lit by the moon dipping below the horizon behind it. Unfortunately, although I had heard Elias Trevitt was a fairly kind and eccentric man, he would rarely, if ever, allow visitors inside. I pushed the manor to the back of my mind as I turned off Central onto my street and into my driveway about a minute later. I left my car in the driveway. My garage door had been broken since Monday morning and I hadn't had time to fix it yet. Home was as dark and still as I'd left it that morning. A comforting, tranquil silence compared to the whipping wind and lashing rain outside. I peeled the wet suit coat off my shoulders and hung it up in the closet to dry as I stepped further in, before removing my shoes and tossing them in the shoe rack. I breathed out a sigh of exhausted relief as I made my way up the stairs. The long workday was finally over, and I could indulge in some rest. The strange wooden puppet I'd seen by the side of the road was the least of my concern as I leapt into bed, still in my work clothes, and drifted off to sleep. The next morning was uneventful. I woke up at 7, showered and ate breakfast by 7:30, and departed at 7:45. The streets of Sudbury were speckled with the occasional drop of rain as I pulled out of my driveway, the remnants of last night's storm. By the time I hit the woods, the rain had all but stopped. As I drove through the forest separating Sudbury and Buckley, I kept my eyes to the side of the road, looking for that puppet again. Eventually, I spotted it off the side of a long straightaway. I slowed the car down to examine the thing a little more closely now that it was day. It was about 25 feet away from the roadside. One hand was still grabbing the branch above it, but the other, which had been at its side the previous night, was now wrapped around the handle of the holstered cavalry sword. For some reason, someone had come out to change the pose. I snapped a photo of it with my phone and kept going. What an odd art project, I thought. I couldn't help but roll my eyes as my tires met the asphalt roads of Buckley. The air was filled with the balmy odor of freshly baked pastries. The sun shined perfectly on the drying roofs and tarmac, and traffic was light, annoyingly so. There was never any problems getting to work, and that somehow made it worse, I thought. As if to mock me, then, a school bus full of smiling young children merged into my lane, pulled in front of me, and started to drive at a truly glacial pace. It got worse when we hit a red light. Then, somehow, it got even fucking worse when I heard someone tap on my driver's side window. I glanced over to see a couple teens who looked to be high school juniors or seniors standing next to my car with vague looks of concern on their faces. I let out a sigh and rolled down the window. "Can I help you?" The one who had tapped on my window, a tall and lanky ginger lad, stepped aside as a girl with short brown hair came up to the window. After a few seconds, she spoke tentatively. "It Looks like one of your taillights is out, mister. There was a silence between us, about 2 or 3 seconds before I let out an exasperated sigh. I'll get it fixed when I get off later tonight. Thank you for letting me know. I tried to remain cordial despite the cynical, bubbling anger welling up in my chest, but she could definitely tell that I was very annoyed. She leaned in a bit closer, darting her eyes from side to side nervously, before she spoke again. I don't, know if you're from around here, but we're doing a bit of a local survey. Have you heard of the cops? A hand slammed down on the car's window molding suddenly, causing both me and the girl to jump back in shock. Oh. Sorry about that, said the man standing next to my car window. He was casually dressed, wearing a cream-colored sweater and some jeans. Didn't mean to scare you, he chuckled out, a light smile spreading across his round, friendly face as he put a hand through his finely combed black hair. Nice to meet you. I'm Elias Trevitt. He put a hand out for me to shake. I was somewhat taken aback. I had always imagined Mr. Trevitt to be much older and more baroque, but the man standing in front of me didn't look a day above 30. I slowly, uncertainly reached my hand out to accept the handshake. Mr. Trevitt, I'd love to converse with you later, but the light's gonna turn green The light will turn green right after our conversation finishes, Mr. Koppelman. At that moment, my mind spun for 2 different reasons. First of all, how did he know when the light would turn green? Was that supposed to have been a joke? Second of all, I had never told him my name. I didn't have my ID and my lanyard yet. We got those when we arrived in the office. So how the hell did he know my name? I just have 2 brief questions to ask you, Mike. He leaned in as he spoke, and once my gaze met his soul-piercing ocean blue eyes, I found it impossible to break eye contact. First of all, what's the model of this car? It's rather interesting, and you keep it well. Might look nice on my lot. 2014 Dodge Charger, I responded. He nodded slowly. I see. Second question. You were the one who saw it last night, right? His eyes narrowed slightly as he examined my face for a response, and his cheesy smile withered a bit. Without needing to think about it much, I realized what he meant. The statue in the woods? The musketeer, yes. What did you think of it? He blinked, and for a moment I was able to avert my gaze. I glanced over to the kids that had previously been trying to talk to me. They were doing their best to hide it, but I could tell that, for some reason, they were terrified of Mr. Trevitt. I was starting to understand why. I swallowed my nerves and moved to respond, boldly locking eyes with him again. It made me jump out of my seat when my high beams hit it moving through the woods, but once I stopped to examine it, it was beautiful. Are you the one who made it? He nodded slowly. Yes. Being a young, rich man gives you a lot of free time to really delve into the arts. I'm glad you liked it, even though it wasn't made for you. That last statement seemed rather pointed, almost like it was supposed to be some kind of threat. I shook my head in confusion. Wait, what? Mr. Trevitt took his hand off my car and stepped back. Well, the light's about to turn green. I'm glad you enjoyed seeing the Musketeer, and I'm sure you'll see more of it soon. Without another word, he turned and walked back onto the sidewalk. I glanced back over to where the kids had been, but they were nowhere to be seen. They must have run off while I wasn't looking. When the light turned green, I let out a sigh of relief and realized that I'd been holding my breath for the last 30 seconds. Was that what people meant when they talked about rich people being eccentric? Even just that brief conversation was absolutely exhausting. I had so many unanswered questions. I arrived at the dam's parking lot about 5 minutes later. The dam itself was actually about half a mile from the lot, pressed in between two short, squat members of the Hissodian mountain range, the only range in Nebraska. The wide, 3-lane road leading through the mountain pass to the dam was guarded by a 15-foot-tall electrified fence gate, peppered with nearly a dozen warning signs and a single active guard. I glanced to my left to see the relatively unassuming 2-story office building I'd be going to instead. I pulled into a spot and stepped out. My taillight wasn't just out. The glass had been shattered and the light itself was dangling out the socket. No wonder those kids had looked worried. It looked like someone had taken a baseball bat to the taillight and then ripped the thing out. That would be both annoying and expensive to replace. The office was bustling with activity as I stepped in the front door. People were frantically running left and right, stacks of papers and laptops under their arms. I nearly ran into someone as I moved towards the reception area. The receptionist glanced up at me as I approached and moved his coffee cup to the side. "You know the drill. Name, department, and role." I rolled my eyes. "Come on, Kyle. You know who I am. Just give me my card." "It's the procedure, man. Last time I handed someone their card without asking, I got a mean talking to from the big man." I sighed. "Mike Koppelman, Ferros Energy Solutions, data analyst." I heard a soft click as he opened a cabinet and pulled out a blank plastic card, before putting it inside of a slot on the top of a card dispensing machine. He punched some text into his computer, and the machine hummed and whirred for a few seconds, before dispensing my key card from a slot in the front. I grabbed it and placed it in the plastic sleeve of my lanyard. As I turned and walked away, Kyle called out, "See you at lunch, man." The rest of my morning was fairly uneventful leading up to lunch. I chipped away at a project I'd been working on for a bit, checking my watch every few minutes until it struck 12:30. Everyone in my department stood up in near unison and started shuffling out of our cubicles. I plopped my lunch tray onto the table and sat down next to a few of my coworkers. I didn't know many of the people here all that well outside of their names, but there were a few of them that were acquaintable enough to spend my 30-minute lunch break with. The only person I actually considered myself friends with here was Kyle, who sat down next to me a few seconds later. "Yo, Ames, that's your 3rd cup today. You're gonna die of a heart attack at 40. Kyle called over to the woman across from me, currently downing a full mug of coffee without even pausing to breathe. "How's the morning been, Kyle?" "It's been alright for me, but it's been a hell of a morning for the PR department, and Strasser's tearing his hair out." "Well, that's good to hear," I responded sarcastically. "Any idea what they're freaking out about?" "One of our ships exploded in the Chicago harbor and did a ton of damage to some nearby warehouses, along with injuring a few people. Surprised you haven't heard about it, man. It was on the morning news." "Well, I didn't really get time to check the news this morning. I don't live in Buckley, remember?" "Oh, yeah, right. You gotta make that long-ass commute from Sudbury. Why don't you just move up here, man?" "This place is too bright. People are too friendly, and the roads are well maintained." "Aren't those all good things, though? Like, those all sound like great reasons to move here. I'm not that big of a fan of living in a place that always feels the need to be happy. Makes me look like an asshole when I'm not feeling it. I mean, I guess? Still, though, maybe the change of scenery would give you a change of attitude. I waved my hand dismissively as I glanced at my phone. At that moment, I remembered the photo I'd taken of the musketeer that morning. Oh, also, I pulled up the photo and flipped it around to show him. I wouldn't see cool shit like this on the way to work. Kyle turned his head to the side inquisitively. The fuck is that, man? It's some kind of art installation put up by Trevitt. He calls it the Musketeer. It's so creepy. Look at all those weird patterns on the front. Patterns? I turned the phone back to myself and squinted. What I had at first dismissed as the texture of the wood, upon closer inspection, appeared to be some kind of strange pattern that had been carved into the musketeer. The pattern wasn't uniform. It was like a bunch of meaningless, interconnected lines wormed across the surface of the puppet. The picture was too low quality to make out any of the finer details of the symbols. I'd have to investigate more on the way home. The ride back through Buckley was about as creepy as one would expect. The sidewalks were cold and empty, illuminated by towering streetlights and the lights coming from business windows. Though there were restaurants that advertised they were open for 24 hours, I didn't see anyone in them. The chairs sat empty, tables unoccupied by menus or plates. The 24-hour hardware store was empty of both employees and shoppers. Even the gas station had nobody at the counter. It was like the entire town had been calmly abandoned just hours ago. I didn't even realize that the entire world was silent, as if it had been holding its breath until a new sound entered my ears. It was quiet at first, a low rumble in the distance. Over time, though, it got louder and more familiar. An approaching car. I glanced up at my overhead mirror to see a black Ford Mustang driving behind me at a distance of about 500 feet, though it was slowly gaining on me. I hadn't seen or heard any other cars in the 5 or so minutes I had been driving, so this came as somewhat of a surprise. Perhaps it was another coworker on the way home, I figured. It was driving in the same direction I was, after all, and this did happen from time to time. Up ahead was an intersection. I put on my left turn signal. I glanced back up to my mirror to see the driver hadn't turned either signal on. Great, I thought. They're going straight. I turned left and glanced into my mirror to see that a few seconds later, they turned left to follow me. They followed me when I turned right as well. In fact, they followed me all the way through town, keeping a steady distance of about 20 car lengths. The fact that it never tried to close the gap any further than that was both a relief and also kind of unnerving. Finally, after another 5 minutes, I turned left onto the wooded side road that led home. I heard the car that had been trailing me keep driving, crossing the road behind me and finally breaking away. What the hell was that? I thought. Why were they following me? Was it because of my broken taillight? As I drove through the woods, I kept my eyes on the sides of the road, looking for the musketeer, but it seemed I was having no luck. There were just trees. Thoughts of the conversation I'd had with Mr. Trevitt earlier that day floated into my mind. Thoughts about just how strange that conversation had been. It felt like everything he said had two different meanings somehow. Even the most mundane of questions. How did he know that I had seen the musketeer that previous night? What did he mean when he said that it wasn't made for me? He seemed somehow to just know things, like my name, or when that light would turn green, or that I'd see it again soon. The musketeer revealed itself to me where the tree line broke on the outskirts of Sudbury. He was on my right, about 20 feet off the roadside. His hand had moved again. The cavalry sword was halfway outside the sheath, and I could see the glint of genuine steel that made up the polished blade. I stopped my car, took out my phone, and took another photo. It was in that moment that I realized something was different, aside from the pose. I pulled up the photo from this morning to realize two bone-chilling things. First of all, the puppet was about 5 feet closer. I swiped through the picture from yesterday night to see that it was further away than it had been this morning. Every time I saw it, it had gotten about 5 feet closer to the roadside. That was only the first realization, though. Second was the realization that it had actually moved location completely each time. First, it was about halfway between Sudbury and Buckley, around the steep left that always gave me trouble coming home. Then, it was off a straightaway much closer to Sudbury. Now, it was at the border between Sudbury and the woods. My mind came up with a satisfying, rational conclusion rather quickly. This was part of Trevitt's art piece. The idea that the musketeer seemed alive, that it moved and adjusted its gear likely multiple times a day, was some kind of commentary on war or exploration or something. I moved to roll the car forward before I remembered the discussion I'd had with Kyle about the strange pattern on the musketeer. There was no way in hell I was going to get out of the car to look at it. Despite the rationalizations I had come up with, my perception of the puppet had changed to the idea that it was something sinister. Unfortunately, I was too far away to really make out anything concrete about the pattern, aside from the fact that I could affirm it existed much more clearly now. With nothing else to gain, I set the car back into drive and rolled into Sudbury. The 5-minute drive through Sudbury was nerve-wracking. The cold, empty streets, which I usually found strangely comforting, felt oppressively silent, as if all sound had been strangled from the throat of the world. At every moment I worried that the mysterious black vehicle that had been trailing me earlier would scream around a corner and strike my car head-on. Thankfully, that moment never came. I pulled into my driveway and parked the car safely. As my door closed behind me, I let out a sigh of relief. I flicked on the foyer lights and slowly made my way upstairs, throwing my suit coat over the banister about halfway up. I rubbed my temples with my thumb and ring finger as I ascended, the strange events of the day doing more than their fair share to tire me out. Tomorrow is a Friday, I thought. I'm done with work for the week. Thank God. I collapsed into bed as if I was trying to make a snow angel within the bedsheets. It didn't take me long to drift off to sleep. Tomorrow, this will all seem like a bad dream, I assured myself. I awoke in bed to find myself drenched in sweat. My hands gripped the linen bedsheet so hard that my knuckles were white, and my eyes darted around the room frantically. My entire body was pressing down into the bed, as if I was shrinking into it in fear. My heart screamed in my chest. After about a minute, I was able to calm myself down with some breathing exercises that I'd learned in anger management class. Once my body relaxed, I sat up in bed and glanced over at my alarm clock. 3:11 a.m. God damn it. Though I'd calmed down a bit, my body was still far too wired to go back to sleep. I was certain that I'd had some kind of nightmare, but I couldn't remember any of it. That wasn't surprising for me, though. I barely remembered any of my dreams at all. My therapist would have probably said something to the tune of, Your nightmare was most likely caused by a recent increase in stress and anxiety. I made my way downstairs, the patter of rain on my windows making itself apparent as I descended. My suit coat was still draped over the banister, so I grabbed it on the way down and haphazardly tossed it into the laundry room. I meandered into the kitchen and opened my fridge to search for some milk to warm up, but was disappointed to find that it had expired yesterday. With an exasperated sigh, I closed the fridge and dragged myself into the living room, sinking onto the couch like it was a marshmallow. I felt around for the remote, finally grabbing it after a few seconds and turning on the TV that sat on the wall below the stairs on the other side of the room. A local late-night news broadcast popped up on screen, though it didn't look very interesting.
Not a lot of places you can see it. There is a theater in Buckley that'll be showing it for the opening week. In other news, a counter-terrorism operation...
As the news anchor prattled on, my eyes locked onto the back door as I noticed that my yard lights were on. I bolted up from the couch and quickly strode over to the back door, anxiously combing through my hair with my hand. Perhaps I was being paranoid, but it immensely worried me that those lights were on, mainly because my yard lights were motion activated. As I approached the door, the yard lights turned off. Whatever movement had occurred in my yard had stopped. I knew what I'd see well before my phone flashlight illuminated it. The Musketeer. It stood in the middle of my backyard, about 15 feet from the door, cavalry sword fully drawn and pointed directly at me in an accusatory fashion. I swallowed nervously as I stepped backwards, nearly bumping into my dinner table. Someone had moved it here. Someone who knew where I lived. What did they want from me? I slowly stepped to the side, moving carefully around my dinner table and retreating back into the living room, all the while keeping my eyes on the Musketeer. I didn't move my eyes away from the back door even as it faded from view behind the stairs. I kept my eyes locked in its direction as I backpedaled increasingly frantically towards the front door. It was difficult to unlock the door without looking at it, but after a few fumbles I managed to turn the deadbolt. I pulled the handle down and pressed my back against it, causing the door to swing outwards. The lashing wind and rain hit me immediately as I stepped outside, whirling around and running in a dead sprint towards my car. I fumbled for my keys with pale, shaking hands as I stood in front of the door, every second feeling as though the Musketeer was getting closer and closer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to produce them from my pocket and shove them into the door, wrenching it open with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I practically dove into the driver's seat, not even bothering to fully close the door until my car was already rolling backwards down the driveway. I didn't know where to drive. I had no family in the area, and I couldn't exactly crash at one of my colleagues' places. All I needed to do at that moment was get away from the Musketeer. So I just drove, barreling towards Main Street 20 miles above the speed limit. My cold, clammy hands slid on the steering wheel as I drove, and beads of fearful sweat rolled down my quivering brow as my eyes darted towards every dark corner in my vision. It was about 3 minutes before I came to a screeching halt at a stop sign right in front of Main Street. Not a moment after I had come to an abrupt stop, the car raced by on the street in front of me at terrifying speeds. The engine screamed like a baleful banshee as it passed by, sending a torrent of rainwater into my windshield. I'd only caught a glimpse of it in the moment, but that car... it had been a black Mustang. After a few moments of hesitation, I began to follow it. I didn't like what I was doing, but I needed to know where it was going. It slowed down substantially after it passed me to 5 miles below the speed limit. It kept a straight path on Main Street for several minutes, making no attempt to turn or save any time. It seemed that, all of a sudden, the driver wasn't in any hurry to get where they were going. As I followed them, a sense of dread built in my stomach. The Mustang eventually came to a stop in front of a Gothic iron gate flanked by brick walls topped with ghoulish Baroque statues of three-headed guard dogs. The words Trevitt Manor were engraved on a stone plaque next to the massive gate. The passenger side door of the Mustang slid open, and a figure in a long brown cloak stepped out into the pouring rain. They walked over to a metal box that protruded from the wall on the right side of the gate. I was unable to discern the purpose or details of the object from this distance, until the figure removed one hand from their robe and began to move it in a pattern that I recognized as interfacing with a keypad. After a few seconds, a small green light appeared on the metal box and the gate slowly swung open. The figure calmly walked back to the car and climbed back inside, closing the door behind them with a motion that made it seem like an afterthought. The car rolled into the property, and a few moments later, any thoughts of following them were dashed when the gate closed on its own. I watched the taillights roll up the hill towards the manor itself. My socks made a wet slopping sound against my carpet as I entered my own home. If I was going to talk to Trevitt, I would need to change, freshen up a bit, and grab a few things. It took me a few minutes to dry myself off and get changed, but I was feeling slightly more confident now. As I returned downstairs, freshly dressed and a bit more prepared for what might be to come, I noticed out of the corner of my eye that, once again, the yard lights were on. I took a deep breath and turned to look at them. The musketeer's strangely patterned wooden face was pressed against the sliding door. The cavalry sword's tip bent against the glass slightly. The hand not holding the sword had its palm pressing against the door. I decided that I needed to get a closer look. Standing next to the back door, I was close enough to more precisely identify the pattern scrawled across the musketeer's body. It was made up of a grid of intersecting lines, and at each intersection a simplistic geometric shape was etched into it. Symbols of triangles within circles, squares with 9 equidistant dots, 8-sided stars, and other precisely measured shapes dotted the grid. I glanced over at the cavalry sword to see something terrifying. A small crack was beginning to form in the glass at the tip of the blade. That's impossible, I thought. Glass doesn't just crack with no force acting on it. This thing isn't moving. That was when I heard a spine-tingling, whining sound, like a higher-pitched version of nails on a chalkboard. As I slowly turned to my right, taking my gaze off the sword, I saw the hand that had been pressed against the glass. The hand was very slowly closing into a fist, knife-sharp, pointed wooden fingers glacially dragging downwards against the glass and leaving deep, opaque lines in their wake like they were digging trenches. It was moving. I left as quickly as I could, car racing through the neighborhood even faster than before. My original plan had been to ring on the gate and ask to speak to Mr. Trevitt, but that idea seemed willfully childish in the face of what I had just seen. After seeing the musketeer pressing itself against the door, I was now convinced that it was supernatural, and that somehow Mr. Trevitt was involved. If that was the case, he wasn't exactly going to just let me in if I asked him nicely. Calling the police wasn't exactly an option either. What would I tell them? The best I could realistically do was have them grab the musketeer and wheel it away somewhere else. But that didn't guarantee that it wouldn't just show back up the next morning or something. It just kind of seemed to appear wherever it wanted to, so I doubted that something like putting it in a storage unit would stop it. trespassing was my only option. The rain made it difficult to keep my grip on the ledge long enough to pull myself up, but I eventually managed to do so. As I stood atop the wall, I glanced at the unsettling stoneworks flanking either side of me. Alabaster statues of three-headed dogs. The statues were 6.5 feet tall, and appeared to be affixed all along the wall, which encircled the entire property, about every 20 feet. As I jumped down off the brick wall and onto the grass, I felt an unsettling, tingling sensation run its way through my body momentarily. The hair on the back of my neck shot up like sharp quills. I felt like I had just walked into the den of a hibernating bear. The finely carved hedges in his yard waved as the wind whistled by, as if they were welcoming me. The ground underfoot shifted as I walked, dirt turning to mud from the heavy rainfall. The manor sat imposingly at the top of the hill, towering over both me and the rest of the town. The light of the setting moon was obscured behind it. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. By the time I reached the front steps of the manor, I felt like I was going to throw up. The front door was a 12 by 9 foot slab of imposing black iron, adorned with intricate carvings of cats, snakes, owls, goats, ravens, rats, and all other manner of beasts. Across the center of the door were words I could not understand. As I moved to knock on the door, I heard a click. To my surprise, the door opened. Mr. Trevitt stood calmly behind the threshold, hands in the pockets of a long brown blazer. He smiled warmly towards me, a motion that deeply unsettled me. "Good morning, Mr. Koppelman. What brings you around so late?" My mouth hung open in confusion and shock. I was silent. "What? Cat got your tongue?" "Please, I'm rich. I have security cameras and motion sensors across every inch of my property." He tapped his forehead 3 times with his pointer finger as he said that. "Come inside. You look cold, and the rain certainly hasn't helped your pale complexion. Don't worry about the carpet. I have someone coming to clean it tomorrow morning." Without knowing what else to do, I cautiously made my way over the threshold and into the manor. The interior of the manor had a style of Gothic decor that wouldn't be out of place in Dracula's castle. Though I was only able to see the foyer, I could imagine what the rest of the place looked like from the gritty dark wood, crimson cloth, and warm yellow light that the room was comprised of. As Mr. Trevitt led me deeper into the manor, I noticed plain, brown-robed figures standing at the top of the foyer's staircase, looking wordlessly down at me. The manor was like a maze, and within 2 or 3 turns, I was completely lost with no hope of ever finding my way back. Trevitt didn't seem to have a problem, though. He glided through the serpentine halls with the grace of a swan, until he eventually came to a door which seemed to satisfy him. He opened it calmly, stepping back and gesturing for me to enter. I did. Normally, I would have considered the room I had entered to be cozy. 2 crimson-red armchairs sat equidistant from both each other in a blazing fire, and a line of golden tassels accentuated the edges of a triangular carpet that fit perfectly in the middle of the 3 objects. The circular walls of the room were adorned with dark wooden bookshelves that contained books of all manner of topics. The only similarities between these books that they all appeared to be at least 100 years old. Mr. Trevitt took a seat, and I followed suit. "What are you here to talk to me about, Mike?" "Your puppet, the musketeer." "Yes, of course. You're enjoying the company, I'd assume? I gritted my teeth in frustration. You know that I'm not. Mr. Trevitt snapped his fingers, and a moment later I heard the door open. I glanced over to see a tall, brown, hooded figure walk into the room. The door slowly closed behind them as they walked over to stand next to Mr. Trevitt, locking itself with a click. The figure carried with them a unique scent that quickly overpowered the previously neutral smell of the room. It was a difficult smell to place in the moment, but given enough time I would have probably described it as something similar to burning ozone. Mr. Trevitt looked up at the figure briefly and nodded before turning back to me. That's unfortunate, Koppelman. What would you like me to do about that? Make it go away. Mr. Trevitt let out a deep sigh. That isn't something I can do. If I could, I would have. I blinked slowly. What? Oh, come on, Mike. Did you really think that something so beautiful was meant for you? He let out a small chuckle. No. Like I said, it wasn't made for you. It was by pure, unlucky chance that you were the one who saw it first. Unlucky for both of us. That last sentence set me off. Both of us? What could you possibly mean by both of us? How is this in any way inconvenient for you on anywhere near the same level as it is for me? I started to stand up. Koppelman, calm down. He that is soon angry dealeth foolishly, and a man of wicked devices is hated. No. You know something. You know how to stop it, or get it to go away, or something. What does it want from me, and why did you send it after me? You don't seem to understand how this works. I didn't send it after you. Bullshit. I reached down to my waist, drawing my Welther PK-380 from the concealed carry holster and leveling it sideways at his chest. I'd taken it from my gun safe before I left. That was the real reason I'd returned home. The figure next to him tilted their head to the side quickly and moved a half-step forward, but Trevitt's hand shot up like lightning before they could progress any further. The figures stopped and returned to their original position, though their dull eyes were fixed unerringly on the weapon. You are going to tell me everything about what this thing is and what it does, or I will shoot you dead. Mr. Trevitt nodded his head slowly. Of course, Koppelman. The musketeer is a form of construct that many cultures throughout history have had their own names for. In Jewish folklore, they were sculpted of mud and clay by mystics and were called golems. In Norse mythology, the being Mistgulfa was born of clay by Hrungnir to aid in battle against Thor. In Greek myth, the automata known as Talos was created of bronze to protect the island of Crete. In Indian legend, it is said that the Buddha's relics were guarded by automata, created by King Ajatasattu, known as Bhutavahana Yanta. The widely accepted name for them nowadays is construct. They're a surprisingly varied batch of creatures that can realistically be made of any material for any purpose, so long as you know the correct symbols and incantations. They are, as you might guess, not sentient. They don't have any will, personality, or emotions. They are an ancient version of a computer, but one which can much more easily interact with the physical world. The musketeer in particular was very difficult to create, taking me hundreds of hours of work as I pored over antediluvian scrolls of conflicting information and figured out the exact symbols and incantations required for it to work. It's a really interesting process, you know, the creation of What did you make it for? What is its purpose? I interjected. Right, of course. I was rambling. The musketeer was created to kill a specific target and then return to me. Unfortunately, there's no way for me to just select a person by giving it a blood sample or something, so I had to go through some more unorthodox methods of giving it a target. The target I had in mind would have been perfect. It would have killed him before he even got home. Unfortunately, due to some miscommunication on the parts of my hooded friends, they dropped it into the woods at the wrong time, and you saw it instead. He took a deep breath before continuing. The trigger mechanism for the musketeer to begin its pursuit was simple: line of sight. After the activation phrase was uttered aloud by someone who knew and understood the words, and the speaker of the phrase left an area within approximately 350 feet of the musketeer, it would begin searching for a target. The next person to see it would become its target. We planned for it to be dropped off shortly before our target left the office. We dropped it off on their route home, but it just so happened that we dropped it off at the wrong time, and that it was your route home as well. So you really didn't mean for it to target me. Why not just undo it then? If there was an easy way to undo it, our target would probably have been able to deduce it. He has a well of esoteric knowledge that would have allowed him to disable it if a simple solution existed. That's why the deactivation mechanism is incredibly complicated. Fine. We'll come back to that. Why can it seem to teleport? Well, it's not exactly teleporting. When the target gets too far away or is in a spot in three-dimensional space it can't reach, it cheats by jumping up a dimension, walking around the obstacles in its way, and then jumping back down. We can't see it when it moves through the fourth dimension, but it does still take time for it to go places. It wouldn't be possible for a human to do this and stay sane, only inanimate objects can. It's a really strong aspect to give something like that, so, like everything, there has to be a trade-off. The trade-off with this thing is a limit on how fast it can move, and how close to the target it can get in fourth-dimensional space before it has to come back, depending on a specific factor. I glanced around the room nervously. What factor? What lets it get closer? Why has it been getting closer to me every time I see it? Trevitt smiled mischievously, his shiny white teeth glistening in the light of the dancing flame in the fireplace. The more you know about it, the closer it can appear, and the faster it can move. The color drained from my face as I processed what he said. Wait, but I would never have time to finish my sentence, as the curved edge of the cavalry sword jubilantly met my exposed neck and glided through the flesh and muscle as a misty spray of blood came forth. As I fell to the ground, head only still half connected to my body, I saw the musketeer move at a normal pace for the first and last time. It stepped over my twitching form and walked right up to Trevitt, before performing a deep bow like it had just finished the last line of a play. Crimson dripped from the glimmering steel of the cavalry sword. Once it reached the deepest part of the bow, head brought down at a nearly 90-degree angle. I heard the sound of joints locking in place, one by one. The musketeer stood still in front of its creator, purpose finally fulfilled.